So I spent a lot of time reading into all the different artificial intelligence announcements that are coming out, whether it's new products or different AI models or capabilities. And one thing that is becoming increasingly more clear is that the rate of change and the scale of change that is coming is going to increase in frequency and size. So for me personally, this has been something that's been very interesting and exciting to try and stay on top of. But I did a little bit of reflection thinking like trying to figure out why that is for at least for me personally. And I came to the conclusion that one of the contributing factors was my experience as a gamer, playing a lot of different types of video games or board games, strategy games, lots of games in general. And it kind of led me down this thought process of some of the key things that are going to be necessary in dealing with the continued advance of artificial intelligence and the paradigm shifts that they bring with them, and being able to adapt to those effectively in order to continue to understand how the world works, understand where things are going, and what you should be doing with your time. So I decided to create this presentation here to kind of explore those thoughts a little bit more and explain my thought process through that, and make the argument for why video games are actually another important medium for learning in more ways than one, and will only continue to be more useful and more important in the future as AI advances continue. So let's dive right into it here. All right, so the presentation overall is going to cover how gaming itself cultivates valuable skills in adapting to AI and the disruption that it causes, understanding concepts of paradigm shifts themselves and what that means in terms of the advances that are coming out in AI. We're going to explore the specific advantages that gamers possess in navigating these changes. And we're going to learn how gaming, and I'm going to talk about how gaming prepares us for these challenges and the opportunities that they hold ahead. So the first bit here, in order to understand kind of what I'm talking about, just to set the scene, is understanding what paradigm shifts are. And paradigm shifts are just a fundamental change in how we perceive or understand something, in particular, a concept or a system. So normally when something is referred to as a paradigm shift, it is more of a dramatic change, so much so that it changes how you not only think about that thing, but it also guides your actions as well, and how you might approach things differently because of this new paradigm shift, right? Because of this new understanding of how that system works or how the world works in a broader sense. So to give a couple examples of different paradigm shifts that historically have happened, there's a lot of examples in tech, right? Kind of mirroring the artificial intelligence releases that are coming out right now. But some of the key ones would be things like the telephone, email, internet, smartphones, things of that nature that fundamentally changed business, communication, and even day-to-day life and how everyday people interact and go about their days. On the non-tech side, these would be different breakthroughs or fundamental shifts in understanding. The ones that I have here are kind of more on the scientific side. So like the theory of germs is an example, evolution and understanding how we came to be where we're at nowadays. Quantum computing is another big one. And in the civil rights movement as well too. So there's different aspects, there are different types of paradigm shifts, not all tech related. It can be science, it can be social, and it just represents basically a fundamental change in understanding and approach to a given concept or system. So with that kind of basis set, so where this is relevant today, and if you've been paying attention to the news at all, or any of the releases that have been coming out in even just the past couple of months or so, there's a lot of technology and a lot of new advances that are occurring that are either causing a paradigm shift or are the start of a paradigm shift. And where we can see that in the past couple of years specifically would be, of course, with like ChatGPT is kind of the marker for that back in November of 2022. Transformer architecture in general, the diffusion models for AI image generation, the breakthrough with nuclear fusion, proving that it is possible, and now only needs to scale basically and become economically viable. So as I mentioned at the beginning there, we're going to continue to see these kinds of advancements happen more frequently, and the nature of the advancements themselves will be bigger in scale in terms of like what's possible or the amount of benefit that they bring. So a good example of that might be, I should really find the graphic of this, but it's one of my favorite ones to share, which is a year ago we had the very bad AI generated video of Will Smith eating spaghetti, and it was just kind of nightmare fuel. But then you look at now, a year later, what the OpenAI Sora model is capable of producing, and it's a step below regular human video, basically. But it's night and day, and that's only been over the span of a year at this point. So that's going to continue and just continue to get even more crazy as the difference between Will Smith nightmare fuel and Sora is today. That trend will continue exponentially, and I don't even know what that will look like. It's really hard to envision what exponential changes can bring, but it's really exciting. All right, so for gamers here, where do gamers fit in adapting to this rapid change? So the crux of my argument here is predominantly through, at least right now, incidental and implicit learning, that gamers are ready to adapt to these changes by nature of essentially having simulated it or practiced those type of skills or gained those skills through playing games, essentially. There are 3 points to this where I see this realized, and the first point can be summed up as you learn in the game, you learn in real life. And that's basically just saying that there's skills that you learn through gaming that are directly transferable to real world situations. And I'll go into depth a little bit about this more in a couple slides, but this isn't to say, like, if you play Call of Duty, right, the first person shooter war game, that you're going to come out of that a better soldier, right? There are some skills that don't translate simply through the medium in which they're being experienced. So I'm not saying that, but there are skills that games require you to exhibit in order to be successful at them that are transferable. Some of them are more subtle or kind of underlying or fundamental, and some are a bit more explicit, like particular active skills, but more on that in a little bit there. So the other piece that makes gamers more uniquely primed can be summed up through rapid change, rapid gains. So in games, the rapid shifts in environmental changes in paradigm and how the game is played, or how the world in which you're playing operates, simulates and kind of mimics the dynamic changes that are happening in the real world and will continue to happen with more frequency in the future here. So this is kind of promoting a fundamental mindset of being able to adapt to change in an agile manner, right? Expecting change basically, and being ready to move and change your mindset, and being willing to accept a new reality at a faster speed than a non-gamers might, as an example, have trouble wrapping their mind around it or coming to terms with, would be another way of looking at it. So the third piece there with gamers and their unique position could be summed up as rethink rules and redefine success. So there is a certain kind of piggybacking off of the paradigm shift piece in the rapid changes of the point beforehand there. In games, there are elements of games that require the player to basically regain a fundamental understanding of truth in that world, and being able to shift their worldview around that new truth and their strategy, their play style, all the above, in order to continue to advance the plot or to win the game there. So it's a combination of those three things: being able to learn skills in the game that you're in the games that you are playing, the rapid pace of change and the breadth of it in the course of gaming, along with this cognitive flexibility to be able to change your worldview or change your approach based on the environment that you find yourself in. So those are kind of the core pieces here. So taking a look then into some of each element individually. So implicit and incidental learning, these are two different types of learning on the wide spectrum of education methodologies or just types of learning that I think are embodied well in today's video games that we see out on the market there. So the first piece of this is the implicit learning. And for a definition of both of these here, implicit, the difference between implicit and incidental is awareness, basically. So in implicit learning would be picking up skills while you're playing a game and not even realizing that you are. So maybe a good kind of benign example of this might be like, let's say even something as simple as like Candy Crush that's been pretty popular. Candy Crush, you could say that you are implicitly learning pattern recognition as an example. Most people wouldn't actively put that together or think, oh yes, I'm learning pattern recognition from this, or I'm using this to help me train my pattern recognition. It's just something that they would kind of pick up over time by nature of playing the game a lot. So the other piece of that would be the incidental learning. So this is learning that you are aware of, but again, it's not the core focus of the game. So it's the difference between playing like a gamified learning application where the whole goal is to learn something. It's more so realizing that you are picking up skills but you're not directly setting out to learn them. So a good example of this might be it's an older game, but some of like the business management games, like let's say like Zoo Tycoon as an example. And for those who aren't familiar, this is a game where you basically run your own zoo. And one of the things that you might pick up by nature of playing it is a little bit of business management skills, right? Depending on how well the game is tailored to simulate an actual business environment, there are elements of that are modeled in the game, like resource and finance management, crises management, and things of that sort that you might realize to yourself as you're playing the game, like, oh, I'm actually kind of picking up a couple baseline business skills in playing this. So that's kind of the main difference between the two, and it's also the main vehicle or the engine in which the learning is gained in these cases through games. So implicit, just by nature of playing it, you're picking these skills up whether or not you realize it, and incidental being the skills that you learn along the way without it being your direct intention to learn them. So I know that there might also be people who think that this argument could possibly be applied to literature as well, and I think that there's a distinction between the two, and video games as a medium are unique in a number of different ways that makes them a lot more viable as a learning tool and a learning mechanism. It's a different type of learning. I'm not saying that books and literature don't provide learning, since that's a core component of it. But this type of learning that I'm describing, I think, is unique to video games for a number of different reasons. Looking at some of the ones that I've kind of gathered here and just kind of going through the main differences of each one here. For books, they're in terms of personalization, they are one size fits all, right? You don't see different books rewritten at different reading levels as an example. It's just the book, right? It's just the text that the author has written in the ideas that they've put forth, versus video games are tailored, right? They can meet the player where they're at in terms of difficulty. You can change the difficulty from easy to hard, depending on where you are. It can fit your play style or your preferences. So there's more personalization there to be able to, from a learning perspective, grow with the player, basically, and to continue to challenge and engage them to foster that learning. The other difference is feedback. So for books, it's delayed in the sense that when you're reading the book, it's basically at the end of the book there where you would then discuss it with somebody else, versus with video games, the feedback is instantaneous, right? And it comes from the game itself. Like when you're playing the game, whether or not you've done a good job, whether or not your character has died, or you've achieved your accomplishment or your objective that you set out for. So it's delayed versus instant, which helps to kind of reinforce that learning feedback loop. There's definitely the engagement side of it as well, where when, of course, reading, it's solitary. There's very minimal interaction. You're stationary, and you're basically just trying to interpret text mentally inside of your brain, inside of your head. Versus with video games, there's a lot more. There's a highly active engagement element to it through, by nature of the player agency is a good piece of that, right? So just taking input and requiring input from the player, collaborating with others, depending on the type of game, they're overall a lot more engaging than books are. I'm going to go down now at this point here. The other difference is decision making. Books are basically predetermined, right? You've got, like I said before, you've got the story, the way that the author wrote it, and that's kind of it. You have very minimal instances of that would ever appear. Like the closest one that comes to my mind is like Goosebumps, choose your own adventure type of thing, where there's some choice, but overall it's pretty limited. It's just turning the page there. Versus, again, as I mentioned about the engagement part, the player is an active agent in the world, right? So the world, the story, the game itself advances through player agency and interaction. So that's one of the key differences there. Otherwise, another piece would be problem solving. The books themselves are highly contextual, where the only problem solving that you're really doing is based on the text and the story itself in the confined space of those words that you're reading on the screen, and also kind of limited to like essentially narrative problem solving and or like mental puzzles, where you're trying to understand relationships between people or what foreshadowing might entail. But comparatively to video games, the level of problem solving is much more dynamic there, where a player needs to adapt to new rules that are overlaid on the game world itself, to different environments. They need to problem solve with different strategies or challenges that come up over the course of the game. So it engages a lot more of those cognitive skills and strategic thinking and problem solving in order to overcome what the game is presenting. So adaptability is another key piece of that, where for literature, the reader is just adapting to the static text itself and ingesting it as information is fed to them. So whether that's new plot points that are happening, or things that characters have said, or new pieces of information that way, and kind of just updating their mental model of it. Versus with video games, the player has many more layers that they need to adapt to. So it's not only just changes in plot and story and new information that's introduced that way, it's also adapting to changes in the environment that their characters in within the game, or the rules of that environment, right? Or just the rules of how the game is even played can change during the course of it there. So, and subsequently then having to adapt their entire strategy on how to win said game. So the dynamism that is present in video games is just starkly different. So I already went over the immediate feedback piece, so I'll skip then down to purpose. So another piece would be purpose, and what I mean by this is kind of more like intent almost. So like when you're reading a book, the purpose of that book is more implicit, right? It's what do you take away from it from the reader, and what are you trying to do or accomplish while you're reading the book? So a lot of what that is internalized in the form of just trying to understand some of the different themes, or like trying to piece together what parts of the story are foreshadowing, different hints or messages that the book is dropping, or overall, like if the author is trying to convey a theme or like a holistic message about, or a commentary on something through the book itself. That is all kind of implicit in the nature of the book itself, and what the book is wanting you to kind of take away from it, like the purpose of the book and the story itself. Where video games differ with this is a lot of the purpose aspects of it are more explicit, and these are manifested in the way of like objectives or quests or things of that nature, missions that you have to do, tasks that you're trying to accomplish within the game itself. There of course are other games that are less task oriented, but even in some of the games that you might consider a little bit more open world, where there isn't really an overarching mission or storyline. Let's say like another common one would be like Minecraft as an example on the creative mode. even when playing Minecraft and kind of the open world creative side of it, there are still explicit tasks that you would break down while playing that, like things that you are trying to build or create. You need to build a house. You need to then build the door on the front of it. You want to install a second layer to it there. You want to build a really cool tower. You need to try to figure out how to make a really cool engine using some of the redstone and other mechanics within the game to power a contraption. Like all of that is still task oriented or objective oriented of things that you were trying to do and the purpose that you were trying to gain from interacting with this medium. So the other piece then that is different is the cognitive load. So for that, when you're reading a book, it's mainly just processing text and like maintaining focus on the narrative itself. There, other than like trying to learn or read a textbook specifically that has, or anything else that you would consider like very dense material, the overall cognitive load of just reading a book, right, it would be pretty moderate. So maybe a good example to kind of draw a comparison here would be if you look at the difference between like the Witcher books versus playing the Witcher games. So the cognitive load for playing video games would be much higher than that of just reading text and understanding it from a book. So for like like the Witcher 3 video game as an example, you're constantly juggling multiple tasks, right? You're multitasking, trying to avoid getting killed by enemies. As an example, you're balancing your inventory, your resources, how much gold or money that you have available, along with also timing, right? If you're trying to balance between doing side quests versus the main mission, as an example, and all sorts of other stimuli that happen in the course of video games, depending on the medium. So the overall cognitive load is just much, much higher. The other main difference of why this is more unique to video games too is just the breadth of skills that are available to develop through the respective medium. So for literature and for books, it's a lot more analytical, I would say, where it's focusing on at a base level. It could be vocabulary, reading speed, comprehension, things of that sort. And again, other than books that explicitly are designed to impart knowledge, like a textbook or something similar, the implicit or incidental type skills that you could learn are very few when confined to only reading content and internally processing it in your mind from a page there. So the difference then with video games is that there's a much wider breadth, right? Where the types of skills that you can learn greatly depend on the game type that you're playing, but it could be anything from hand-eye coordination to multitasking to just general awareness of things like perception based. There's also social aspects of it as well too, like teamwork and leadership. So it's varied as opposed to the limited availability of skills that books can impart by nature of implicit or incidental learning. So the last piece here is something that I believe helps to tie into a more effective learning environment as well, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next slide here. But the difference too of games versus literature is that games also have a much more stressful environment in which they're operated in. And this isn't to say like the same kind of negative stress that you might get from your job overworking you type of thing, or being in a life or death situation necessarily. It's more kind of a combination between the what's called eustress, so like the positive stress that you get from like striving towards a challenge. And then also there are some simulated aspects of the negative stress elements as well that play into it, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next bit here, like I was saying. So for books, pretty low key, right? You're reading, it's relaxed, it's very self-directed. Not much stress going on in the act of reading a book. And for video games, then it's much more, I would say, moderate to high, depending on the type of video game. Playing Candy Crush, as an example, isn't exactly super stressful, but there are some much faster paced games with much higher stakes that would be a lot more stressful, and that also have consequences too as you're playing them that would contribute to that. So speaking on the stressful environment piece, so this is actually something that I started to touch on a little bit in an interview that I was a part of from the YouTuber David Shapiro. And we during the course of our conversation, I mentioned a topic that I'm kind of working my thoughts through and that I'm interested in called contextual edutainment. And this is one of the elements that I think that contributes to the feasibility of the learning that I'm describing here through video games. So basically, there are, from what I had discussed with him in that interview, there are 7 parts to a successful, stressful learning environment. And games are really well suited for exemplifying each one of these. With games, there is an aspect of uncertainty of outcome, right? You don't know whether or not you're going to win the match that you're playing, or whether or not you're going to be able to jump across the cliff, or if you'll end up falling to your character's death there. There's a sense of urgency depending on the game there, where normally it's either you against the clock, if it's like a timed thing, or there's something within the game storyline itself, like you need to reach this point and save the princess, let's just say, and if you don't do that quick enough, you end up failing that mission. So there's a level of urgency that is present in games, especially competitive games as well, where it's you against another player. It's that element of judgment and decision making that I mentioned before, where again, as opposed to just passively learning something, by being more of an agent in your own learning path there, it helps to solidify what you're learning in your own mind, since you are an active contributor to that. You're not just attempting to open your mind and become a sponge to ingest information. You actually need to retain some of this information in order to make judgment calls and decisions in the context of the game that you're playing there. So that also kind of alludes to the next point, which is stakes or consequence, or a layer of risk there to it, right? If you don't memorize or understand the strategy or the way that the game works, or the fundamental truths of that universe, then you might end up losing the game there, right? Or you might fail a mission, or you would, if you're playing, again, a competitive game of some sort, then you might end up just losing the match there. So, and then depending on the style of game, there are ones that take that even to the next level, where instead of allowing you to save the game or to restart over, actually, there are games that kind of have what's called a hardcore mode, where if you die, or if your character dies, then that's it. You can't respawn. You have to start a new character. So there's layers of things at stake to help keep the player engaged with it, and that make the choices that you're making and the things that you're learning about the game or from the game and how you approach it a lot more, makes it carry a heavier weight to it. So with that, speaking of competitive games, there would be the other difference too, or the other benefit of video games as a unique medium would be the presence of adversarial agents. And what this could be is, it depending on the type of game, it might take the form of another player that you're playing against. It could take the form of a non-player character, or like an AI-controlled computer player, or just the game world itself, right? It is actively acting against you. It could be something that is the more of a passive adversarial agent, like in the case of the interview that David interviewed me for. The example that he drew on was the Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes VR game, where the adversarial agent in that case would just be time, or the bomb that you're trying to defuse in that game. And lastly, if no other agents exist in most games, typically the default would then be just yourself, right? You were trying to, again, depending on the nature of the game, you're trying to beat your old high score, right? You're trying to be a better version of the player that you were the time before, do the same mission but faster, or to die fewer times. And a lot of those kind of adversarial elements are gamified into the game itself through achievements or other badges or things like that the player can unlock by doing those scenarios in a more difficult manner, or in an improved manner than the time that they did before. So another key element of a stressful learning environment would be the presence of imperfect information. So this is something brought up normally in game theory, describing how there is the two sides of a game aren't playing with the same information. So this would be the equivalent of like when you're playing a poker, as an example, where you don't know what is in your opponent's hand, nor what the deck itself will reveal versus what's in your hand. So that would be a good example of imperfect information versus a game like chess or checkers is perfect information, where you can see all the pieces on the map or on the board there, all the moves that are available. You can see them all and be able to act with all of that information in mind. Most video games have an element of imperfect information through, typically again expressed through adversarial agents there, where NPCs or other players are able to act upon the world and you can't necessarily see where they are in that respect, or they're not limited in the amount of moves that they can make because it's all real time, as an example. And then the final piece there that I had would be an element of self-improvement. So being able to have something in which to, or a feedback loop to kind of gauge yourself against, whether that's being able to complete something with dying a fewer number of times throughout the course of the game or faster than you did before, and being able to see those improvements and watch yourself improve over time as you continue to engage with the video game. So I mentioned in the last slide there, I kind of brought up like chess and checkers and things like that. And if you've made it this far in the video, you're probably thinking to yourself, with some of the games that I've mentioned, like Candy Crush or checkers or chess, that how in the heck does that help to prepare us for paradigm shifts caused by AI? And there would be a spectrum. My argument would be that there's a spectrum of the skills that are available to that one might learn through playing video games based on the level of complexity that the game presents. So traditional strategy games in the form of like chess, Go, or checkers, I would say are probably on the lowest tier in the sense that there's a lot less of those stressful environment factors. And on top of that, the amount of skills that are available for one to learn or to exhibit are also fewer. So that would kind of be where I would put most traditional strategy games, is in that level. Some of the skills, though, that you might still be able to develop in some way could be a level of strategic thinking, trying to plan ahead and also anticipate players' next moves based on a known number of moves that are available there. So some elements of foresight, and then maybe even patience as well to try to execute some of the strategies that are leveraged in games like chess and checkers. So the next level, I would say, is kind of where you'd start to put some more of the like next tier up, or well, obviously next tier literally here, but the next level up of puzzle and board games. So these might be some of the ones that you've seen, like Settlers of Catan is a pretty popular one, or Ticket to Ride would be another example there, where games like these, there's a higher level of problem solving that's involved because they add more dynamic rules to the games or functions, or as in games, they're typically called mechanics to the game itself. So there's more of a breadth of things that you have to consider from there. So other skills might be a layer of like critical thinking. There's a bit of like spatial reasoning too, depending on the type of game that you're playing. You could even do like through games like, let's say, Scrabble, there'd be a bit more of a vocabulary element to it. And then this is kind of the tier of games as well that would start to introduce more resource management as another example. So moving up a bit there, we've got one player video games. So these could be things like traditional RPGs where it's just you as the player playing through the game itself, like Final Fantasy, or puzzle games like the original Portal, or even some of the more modern RPG titles that are coming out, like Cyberpunk 2077 as an example there. For this layer, this is kind of where we would start to enter like the higher complexity level, that this third tier here. And some of the skills that you might be able to gain would be another layer of strategic planning. There's puzzle solving elements, so pattern recognition, creativity, resource management, and then perseverance would be another one in this case, where, especially with games like Cyberpunk as an example, where some scenarios might be much more difficult than others, and you have to repeat the same mission over and over again, depending on how many times you die or until you learn the best way of going about it. So there are even some of those, again, more kind of like fundamental or baseline skills like perseverance or resilience is another way of thinking of it, that are started to be trained or tested in this level. So next, moving up then would be what I would consider like a very high complexity level, where you'd see games like League of Legends, StarCraft 2. These are games that start to introduce a lot more multitasking to what the player is expected to do, where they're juggling many different things at the same time. And especially like in the first two, if you're playing competitive StarCraft, that is, or at least, or multiplayer StarCraft, where you start to get more of those elements of the layers of stress that would go into playing these games to help reinforce some of those things. When you're adding in kind of a multiplayer aspect to it as well, this is also where you start to add in some of the social skills like team coordination or leadership or things of that nature. The faster pace of them would be like helps to hone more quick decision making, as an example. This is also probably where I would also place in some of the more like tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons, or one of my favorites, which is Shadowrun. And the reason I would kind of put this in this higher complexity level, but not still quite at the top, is predominantly due to pacing, I would say. And then also the level of stimuli and, again, the stress of the environment aren't still quite there as some of the higher, as the next tier, basically, where you do have that broader breadth of options that are available to you playing a tabletop RPG, where essentially your limits are your imagination mixed with the rules of the world and the capability of your dungeon master or your game master, and the nature of the challenges in the story that said game master would come up with. So for the highest tier here, this is where I would start to put some of the games that are a bit more, depending on the medium, outside of the mainstream, where there's a certain type of player or play style that is particularly interested in these style of simulation and strategy games. So some of the examples that I put here are like Civilization 6. Stellaris is a space empire management game, and then my personal favorite, which is Total War Warhammer 3, which is a game very similar to Civilization, where you have kind of a world map view and you are managing different cities and settlements and things like that, but it adds another layer of actually controlling the armies when they do combat. So it's a medieval kind of a fantasy war game / empire management game. But even just by like that little that description there of those, like these are games where you are managing an entire civilization or a galactic empire, where you're not only in charge of just deciding where settlements get built, you're also trying to manage resources in which to build them, or if you don't, your civilization might start to die. You have to build the infrastructure within the different planets or cities. You have to train individual units and troops in order to help defend the civilization, and then decide what their composition is going to be, if you're going to have more frigates or cruisers in your fleet, or if you're going to have more musketmen or swordsmen in your army in order to fight against the different nations that you're finding yourself surrounded in. There's also a diplomatic element, interacting with other, both sometimes players, but otherwise just other empires. There's a population morale and happiness and control element. So I could go on here, but you can get the point that there are layers of games that offer even more skills for people to practice and exemplify as they are, just by nature of playing the game itself. So some of the ones here, just to kind of put it into explicit terms, might be like logistical coordination or long-term resource management, complex problem solving when you have multiple systems that are interacting with each other, trying to come to a positive outcome to achieve an objective. So this category too is where I would place. I didn't mention virtual reality anywhere on here, but depending on the type, again, it really depends on the type of video game itself that is being played. So there are some virtual reality games that may not be at this top tier, according to my analysis here. But I would say VR as a whole tends to raise up the tier that the game is on. So if it was checkers in VR, I would bump it up one level to tier 4 there. If anything, only for the fact that you were now having to exist in another, basically in another world, so to speak, and manage more like a different type of hand-eye coordination through the manipulation of a controller, as an example. But VR is really where, and I'll definitely talk about this later too, but VR is definitely the next level of where this all evolves to, especially in conjunction with artificial intelligence, since it adds more spatial skills to the repertoire of things that are being practiced or, again, exemplified in the course of playing the game. And the immersion too would be another element as well that also helps to up the efficacy of learning in that type of through that type of medium. All right, so out of all the skills that I've kind of touched on here a little bit, the main 3 skills that I think that you could boil down why video games and gaming in general has prepared gamers to be better suited to adapt to paradigm shifts would be adaptability, creative problem solving, and cognitive flexibility. So these 3 are kind of the core part of this thesis that support it, where if we take a look at each one, just to kind of touch on each point here, for adaptability, depending on the game that you're playing, there's a layer of like constantly changing elements when it comes to that game, even if it's just as simple as your character moving through the world and the environment is changing around you. But there's a lot of different games that also have elements of even just like the core mechanics changing. Like these cards are worth 2 points now instead of 1. That might change the strategy depending on how many of those cards that you have. In games, you're required to adapt to new enemies, different levels that you move yourself to, difficulty or like physical environment itself, or different challenges that you have to adapt to as well. In one part of the game, you might be doing a diplomatic thing where you have to choose the right dialogue options. And another part, you might be commanding an army, or you might be using a first-person shooter type style where you have to defeat somebody in a skill of marksmanship or just reflex or something like that. So there's a lot of components that you need to adapt to throughout the course of playing it. Of course, all of which are also typically real time, and even just through nature of the software and game development process itself, there are also frequent updates and patches that completely alter gameplay, either through the form of an expansion or just a fix in some way or another that also require players to adapt to the new paradigm. Sometimes too, this is also referred to in gaming as the meta, which is the paradigm basically that is the most widely recognized as being the best or most viable way of playing that game or winning that game. So creative problem solving, I think this one's pretty apparent there. There's in any number of games, there are different challenges or obstacles that you have to overcome in some way or another. And depending on the game, it rewards most players for thinking outside the box or in different innovative ways. One of the ways where this is, I think, the most apparent would be in those tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and Shadowrun, or Pathfinder would be another one, where the player has that level of agency to basically do whatever they want, in the sense that they're not constrained by a pre-programmed or prescribed set of actions that they're able to do within the limitations of the controller or keyboard mouse interface and what the game has been programmed to allow them to do, right? So there's a lot more creative problem solving that you can display in games that are of that kind of more theater of the mind style. So, and then the last piece that is kind of honed by the other two is the cognitive flexibility. So this differs a bit from adaptability, where I would say that adaptability would be more reactive in the sense of being able to adapt to a change that has just happened and to pivot almost. Whereas cognitive flexibility, to me, it would be more changing your fundamental view on how the game is played, or a completely different play style or strategy. It's more about like a shift in perspective and approach than it is to adapting to the challenge at hand. So like being able to switch from shooting a gun to doing a mental puzzle would be adaptability, versus changing your understanding that initially you thought the game wanted you to win the shooting challenge, and complete the puzzle, but in reality, you've come to the understanding that now the game actually wants you to do something completely different, like fail both of those, or find a way to break the game so that you don't even have to complete the challenge. So that was kind of a little bit obscure there, but I think you can kind of get the point there. So it's a shift in like mindset and approach and understanding versus adapting to immediate stimuli, basically. So those are the core components then of like what helps to prepare gamers better for adapting to paradigm shifts from artificial intelligence. So, and there are a number of different skills that I didn't mention just to kind of show some of the few that I did along with a few additional ones. But due to the diversity of what's available through the medium of video games, tabletop games, board games, all the above there, especially VR games as well, that there's just so many different skills that can be acquired just by nature of engaging with the game itself as the medium. All right, so to give a more concrete example of like what a paradigm shift in a video game might look like, there's a game that I've played that I really enjoyed called Super Hot, and I played it on the Oculus Quest, so it was in VR, which was super fun. But there is a technique with paradigm shifts that I think that this game exemplifies really well, where the underlying premise of the game is that time only moves when you move. So time is essentially stopped while you're playing the game unless you are moving yourself in virtual reality. And to better exemplify this, I'm just going to play a clip here so you can get a better picture. All right, that was Super Hot VR. So as you saw from the video, it's a mixture of like slow-mo, stop-motion combat where you are presented as the player with the opportunity where if you stop moving, you kind of have a moment to think and plan your next actions. But it's a completely different way of play. You basically have to rewrite your perception of time, right? You have to come to the understanding that, as it says, time only moves when you do. So you have to adapt your mindset to accept that truth that time only moves when you do and rewrite how you view reality. And this brings me into my own story with it, where after I got done playing the game it was probably like 3 or 4 hours in a row at the time. And after working up a sweat playing the game, I stepped outside to cool off. And during the course of me going outside, my roommate came home, and I didn't understand what was happening at the time, but I started to, as he approached me and started to greet me and tell me about his day, I started to have a minor panic attack. And I didn't think about it until looking at that situation in retrospect, that what was happening was my mind was basically screaming at me that you're not moving, he shouldn't be moving. Right? Because I had just spent hours in a world where time only moves when you do. So what that kind of game-induced panic attack, I could kind of sum that up to, is I would liken that to the treadmill effect. And this is the sensation that you get after if you are on a treadmill for a long time, and then all of a sudden you hop off the treadmill and you start to walk again. You experience this kind of visual illusion where it looks like you're moving much faster than you actually are, and your brain is kind of succumbing to this illusion that your surroundings should be moving quicker now that you're actually moving again, because it was spending so much time with your background being stationary. So that I would say is I would draw that parallel to what I experienced from playing Super Hot for a longer period of time, was essentially the treadmill effect impacting my brain with that illusion. So, and that the treadmill effect too, you could almost even liken that to more of a smaller scale or subconscious, again, paradigm shift in that if super hot is time only moves when you do, treadmill is background no longer move when you do. Let's just say, right? So it's your brain rewriting its reality to understand that your scenery no longer moves, right? When even though that your body is moving, which it has come to expect that when your body moves, your scenery moves, right? So that's why you kind of get the weird illusion after you start moving, because it's trying to recalibrate or adjust in real time to that change. However, though, so as the more you exercise on a treadmill and the more frequently you get on and off the treadmill, this illusion tends to diminish over time, just by nature of the brain adapting to that change more frequently. So that's kind of one of the key components there to everything that we've just been talking about. But on a side note, I had this little side tangent that I wanted to include, because that same kind of like brain illusion adaptation made me think of, in the game Warhammer 40K, there's a race of orcs that has this kind of really wonky psychic ability that is essentially, they call it the wah energy, because that's like that's just their thing. But basically, it's this really ridiculous mechanic where if they believe it hard enough, it becomes true. So in the context of the game, or even just the lore of the game itself, an example of this would be they believe that painting vehicles red makes them go faster, and subsequently, just by believing that, then it does. It makes the vehicles go faster. Or by believing that they can fly, then they could, or if they could believe that they could go back in time, then they can do that. And the more of them that believe something, the stronger that it is. Another example in the lore would be there's a famous character whose name I don't remember, but basically the orcs all believe that he is unkillable, and thus he is, right? So it comes to be just through the collective nature of their belief. So what I thought was funny was I had this kind of like parallel thought process of humans are actually a lot like Warhammer 40K orcs in terms of both how our brains work and how we collectively work. So some examples of this that came to mind were like the perceptual pieces. So it started and triggered there from the visual illusion with super hot or with the treadmill there. But our brain basically alters our perception to match beliefs or things that we expect. So like we believe that scenery moves when we move, or we expect it to, at least. So some of the ways that this can be also seen are through some of the popular online, like, I don't know, controversies or whatever that came up, like the blue dress versus the gold dress picture as an example. Like you see what you believe you see or what you want to see. Again, the treadmill effect is part of that. Or even like there's another illusion there too, where like the gray, it's a gray square on a like a black and white checkerboard. And the square looks a different color depending on like which background it's on, but in reality it's the same brightness, or it's the same color either way. So that's kind of our brain seeing what we want to see or what we would expect to see. So that's kind of the perception altering effect. There's also an element of collective belief parallel with the orcs there, which is it works because we believe it does. And this is something that you can observe in like fashion trends as an example. We believe that something is fashionable because enough people believe that it is fashionable, or like the stock market is an example. Otherwise, even like social norms, like language, we believe words mean certain things collectively. Laws would be another good example, where laws work because we believe in the laws, right? And that people would adhere to it. Another layer of this that I thought was interesting too is kind of the like social identity, right? Where there's an element of like almost another piece of this is kind of a confirmation bias a bit. But for social identity, it's the, like, let's say us Americans believe that we are industrious, thus we become, thus we are collectively, right? Because we believe it to be so it affects how we act, as an example there. So this also, of course, can take on the negative effect too, where if enough people believe that America is divided, that also kind of gets willed into existence as well, through the nature of it predisposing people to act a certain way or act with certain assumptions. So this is also apparent in something called the Pygmalion effect, which is basically that our beliefs and actions impact people to then behave in the way that we initially expected, right? So if you believe that, let's say, just for the sake of this video here, if you believe that gamers are bad people, as an example, then you are more likely to treat them in a way that would have them react in a manner that would reinforce that to you, right? They would react negatively, thus reinforcing to you that yes, gamers are bad people, just as an example there. So another part of that too then is, so instead of just believing about specific things working, it's like believing things into reality, which is also another thing that the Warhammer 40K orcs can do as well. And this would be exemplified through our brain's ability to manifest our own beliefs into reality. It's through like the placebo effect would be a good example of that. Or even like psychosomatic injuries could be another example, along with self-fulfilling prophecies. And this kind of also still ties into the Pygmalion effect or the confirmation bias element of it. But basically, where if we think something to be true, for the self-fulfilling prophecy part of that, that's basically where you will seek out information that ends up confirming that, typically subconsciously. But that also can happen too on a broader scale where, for example, might be if you believe your company is going to fail, that might impact the way that this manifests in you through your work and the quality of the work that you do, thus subsequently making the company fail through your poor effort. So it's kind of just touching on the thoughts made manifest aspect or self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of the human brain there, which I just thought it was a fun parallel that happened to pop up into my mind. So going back to the plot here, with the super hot game there, the technique that I mentioned is the ability to take a paradigm shift and boil it down into a single statement of distilled truth, so to speak. And the super hot one is very apparent and very tangible in the fact that it is literally how the world works around you, time only moving when you do. But this is something that can be leveraged to applied to different types of paradigm shifts to try to then use as a lens through which to think about how that shift itself or that statement affects everything else. So just to touch on, again, the super hot one there, if you understand that time only moves when you do, then again, in the context of the game, that means that now I can actually just stop moving and have all the time in the world to think, right? To plan my next actions or to understand what's happening in the scenario around me, make sure I spot all the little red guys there and do a full kind of look with my eyes only to see what weapons or objects do I have at my disposal in order to beat this mission, right? So that is the lens to pass it through, is that time only moves when you do, thus I can do this, or thus this means this is a possibility, right? So looking at just some of those different, the tech related paradigm shifts that I mentioned earlier, if you can try to boil some of those down to single statements of truth, then you can start to pivot those to different areas of life. So for example, like the telephone, communication is no longer bound by distance, right? So what does that mean? What does that enable for business? The internet was another good one. Global connectivity is ubiquitous and seamless, right? So things are always connected all the time, and it's not as separated as traditional supply chains are in terms of stages or things going from one place to another or different delays in the process there. How does that impact business? Right? What does that do to the business landscape or the number of companies or business models that are viable? I think we know what the outcome of that was, being the modern day here. But but practicing this is a good way of being able to try and understand how things are changing or what these changes mean to different aspects of life. And there isn't the one statement distilled truth technique that I'm mentioning here. Each one of these statements isn't all encompassing necessarily. If it can be, like if you can kind of distill it down to that level of clarity and like economy of words, like truthfulness, then that's great. But it doesn't necessarily even have to be a single sentence, because you could also produce multiple versions of these statements depending again on the context that you're looking to apply it to. So depending on how you approach it, if you could try to leverage like first principles thinking to try to get it very fundamental, that could be applied to multiple or most things, or you could kind of try to rewrite it in single statements that only maybe apply to a lesser subset of different aspects, like business or personal relationships, things of that nature. But the point is to be able to take the complexity of a paradigm shift and be able to distill it down into something that is easily understandable to then use as a lens to pass through and understand other aspects of life. So a couple examples for some of the non-tech ones here, like that represent fundamental, again, paradigm shifts or shifts in understanding. Some of them are pretty self-evident, like when you look at, let's say, like women's suffrage as an example. Voting is a universal right. So that was a fundamental shift in understanding of who gets to vote. Another one just to call out too would be like psychoanalysis. This is kind of where like this shift in understanding, so the unconscious mind shapes behavior, is what led to a lot of the discoveries and even some of the pieces that I just talked about in the little orc tangent there about like confirmation bias as an example, or the Pygmalion effect. Things like that wouldn't be things that we would have even considered prior or have lent as much credence to prior to that paradigm shift of understanding about the human mind. So bringing this back then to the present day and some of the more immediate paradigm shifts at hand that have, again, either just started to shift or might be coming sooner and or later, we can kind of go through like each piece here. So generative AI as a whole, just the capability of leveraging it for text, video, images. You could try to boil that down into creativity is democratized and accessible to all, right? Or machines become active participants in the creative process. Or the one that I think is the most relevant to business, especially, is the cost of content creation approaches zero, right? So what does it mean to be a marketing agency or run a business when content creation is now close to nothing in terms of cost? That fundamentally changes how you might approach marketing, or how might that impact marketing as a whole if that same fundamental truth is true for everyone, right? Another one that's up and coming that you might have seen some of the announcements for, or again, I alluded to it with the Will Smith versus Sora video, is OpenAI's new video generation model called Sora that is phenomenal and not publicly accessible currently at the time of recording here. But with the quality of video that it can generate, some of the ways you might try to boil down what that means could be something along the lines of synthetic media blurs the line between the real and the synthetic, right? That's actually one of the primary concerns that you might have seen expressed in the news, is around its ability to facilitate deepfakes and other misinformation campaigns there. So if that's the truth, then how do we change different aspects of our life there? Or what does that mean for my business or my interactions on a personal level on the internet, as an example? On the positive side, though, another way of looking at it as a one truth statement there might be, if you can dream it, you can make it, right? Literally all it takes now is just the idea, and Sora can bring that into reality, as an example, into that medium. And then similarly, as the speed of the inference improves, how quickly it can generate video, another paradigm shift statement might be that digital reality is constructed in real time. And what I think is really interesting too, especially as Sora continues to improve, and from what I've read, if it is true that it was also trained on not just like video content, but content generated through the video game engine Unreal Engine, then this I could definitely see being the start of what leads to like virtual reality MMOs, or what you typically see in different sci-fi, fantasy, or anime, where, as I alluded to a little bit with the title, like Sword Art Online as an example. This could be something that helps to power that world where it's generating everything in real time as the player is exploring through the world, or and reacting to the player's actions, as an example. So another paradigm shift that is coming sooner than later would be agentic AI. And some ways of kind of thinking about that might be that software evolves from tools to partners. Another element might be delegation and collaboration extend beyond human-to-human interactions, right? So now you have the ability to delegate to machines or delegate to programs. And then another part, even more simply, might be that work never stops, right? With the advent of agentic AI that doesn't need to sleep or have coffee breaks or anything like that, you could have your own personal team of agents that are able to do work on your behalf 24/7, right? So from a gaming perspective, one of the parallels that I really like based on one of my favorite classes in different video games to play is the necromancer. And in most games, the necromancer is able to summon and control a number of undead minions to either fight for him or do his bidding in other different unique and clever ways. The one that I always liked for my own adventures there would be, had a necromancer that was gang pressed into working on a ship and forced to pump the bilges. But in order to reserve his strength, he was able to summon a couple of undead skeletons, his literal skeleton crew, to pump the bilges for him. So that was kind of my clever way of leveraging his abilities in class. But case in point there, like again with the gamer parallel here, being able to leverage minions, so to speak, or agentic AI, whether in the form of software or in the form of robotics, to go and do things on your behalf and to kind of manage that or micromanage that, depending on the level. Looking a little bit more then into the distant but not so distant future would be things like embodied AI and embodied agents, or more so kind of like the robotics revolution that seems to be ongoing currently. And when you look at trying to distill those down into single truths, you could maybe say something along the lines of like human labor becomes optional, right? Or human manual labor becomes optional, right? If we have the robots for it and they are physically capable of doing so, at that point, this is something that David Shapiro likes to say, which I really like, which is if it is better, faster, cheaper, and safer than humans, then the society and business will inevitably switch to that, right? So if it's all four of those things better than humans, then human labor becomes optional. Another single truth to distill that down into might be that the lines between digital and the physical blur. And some of the thoughts that I've kind of passed through this lens might be, actually there's a show on Amazon called Peripheral, where they do a little bit of time travel as well in that one. But the point that speaks to me, though, would be the ability to remotely control robots anywhere in the world through VR or with your mind, essentially, depending on the technology that's being used. And what does that do for, let's say, like digital tourism, or what does that do for in terms of the consequences of somebody getting doxxed? Those are some ideas of thoughts that might get passed through that lens. Then the last one there being artificial general intelligence as the end goal of all of the work that's ongoing with OpenAI and the other people in this space. Some ideas of how to boil that down might be all labor becomes automated and abundant, right? So what does that entail for society? Do we no longer need to work? If that's the case, how and why do people create things? There's a lot of conversations that these start to spur for us as a society to have and to consider. And the last two that I have here aren't so much necessarily single distilled truth statements, but more so I think kind of like core challenges that these paradigm shifts will raise. In that AGI, as an example, something that is nigh indistinguishable from human in terms of at least capabilities and intelligence, starts to challenge the understanding of what it means to be alive and conscious. I've seen this phrased in different content that I've seen of if you cannot tell if something is conscious and sentient because it mirrors it so well, does it matter at that point, or would it make more sense to just treat it as if it were, right? If you can't prove the negative, right, in the way that we can prove whether or not we're conscious and not just a firing of a bunch of neurons and cells, as an example. So it starts to raise questions like that. The other one that I'm also really interested in and that I like is, if a simulated experience is indistinguishable from reality, is it any less meaningful or valuable? And I'm not certain that I know the right answer to this, either only my own personal leanings, but it raises that kind of question as we start to delve deeper into our own minds and into simulated realities. What value or meaning do we get out of something being real in a sense? What's the utility of that? Where this is also super exciting to me from, again, a gaming and kind of just an overall nerd perspective, is AGI also is the paradigm shift that starts to make a lot of the popular literature out there, stories, movies, anime, games, into more of a viable reality. So as an example, there's a literary RPG that I really enjoyed that is called Awaken Online. And in the story, there is the characters in it, or the NPCs of the game, are, for all intents and purposes, powered by artificial general intelligence. They're indistinguishable from real people. They have their own hopes and dreams, and you cannot tell that they are not another player, essentially, in terms of all things that matter to determine as such. So with artificial general intelligence, that creates the reality, or the capability of being able to have a completely simulated world in which every NPC has a full life of their own, where they are the main character in their own story, and unlocks a whole slew of possibilities. This also does tie in as well to the future of education and video games as a medium for that, where NPCs are, again, powered by artificial general intelligence and can help to perfectly simulate real scenarios in a world that has increasingly indistinguishable graphics from reality. At that point, the point that I'm making with this overall thesis, it starts to become a lot more viable. So with everything that I talked about today, there are some considerations that I wanted to point out. There's most likely more that I didn't consider when putting this all together as well, but some of the main ones would be adapt the game to the aim, not the aim to the game. If you're trying to learn creative problem solving, Candy Crush probably isn't the best game to be doing that. There is an element of suitability that goes into this. So I'm not universally saying that all games train all skills equally. There's definitely skills that would be more effective than others in transferring skills to the real world or preparing individuals for to adapt to paradigm shifts. So basically the design of the game itself and the complexity, the mechanics that all go into it, all influence its efficacy in doing any sort of skill transfer there. So the other piece would be the depth of the medium determines the height of learning. So this ties in with the complexity pyramid that I had shown earlier, where depending on the nature of the game, if it's something like more simple, you're only going to learn so much, versus games that are more complex or involve more elements of that stressful environment or different stimuli like virtual reality. The breadth of what is available to learn and the depth of how much you learn depends on that complexity entirely. So overall, the level of immersion, the interactivity, social engagement, like all those different levels that exist between the different genres of games, all of those impact player learning and growth. So the other piece that I want to mention there would be that multiple methods multiply successes. So this would be the be cool, stay in school. The more ways that you can approach learning a subject, the better I think that people learn. Games aren't necessarily a replacement for all other different types of learning. Implicit and incidental learning are only a few types of learning that exist. And there is definitely still a place for traditional learning approaches through school webinars, courses, and the more of these that you can do, the better to help solidify your understanding of a particular skill. The other piece, though, I'll put a little asterisk here, though, is in the future, with what I was mentioning with the artificial general intelligence, there's a topic that I'm going to be talking about again in the future called contextual edutainment that I do believe might prove exception to this, but requires some additional advance in technology for sure, or at least its application. So otherwise, the other piece is context is the catalyst for connection. So this is basically understanding that a lot of what I've been talking about during the course of this presentation isn't readily apparent or maybe seamlessly transferable to the real world. There is a layer of, I would say, intention or intent and deliberation that would be necessary in order to really maximize the gains of those skills or allow you to transfer them. Part of it is like through some of the skills that you do gain through gaming that are maybe more on the implicit side, like pattern recognition. Part of that might be becoming aware of those, right, through something similar to as I've been discussing today, of analyzing the games that you play and understanding what skills are required in order to be successful at that game, and converting them then from just implicit to more in that incidental realm and becoming aware of them. Because once you become aware of them, then you can focus on adapting those skills to a different context, right? One that I've really liked is the kind of long-term resource management and logistics that comes from playing games like Warhammer Total War 3 as an example. And being able to deliberately consider how do those skills and my approaches to them in the game transfer to the approaches of my work life, as an example. Like, what aspects of how I approach resource management from within this game can I transfer over to that? And then from there, after becoming conscious of it and be deliberately engaging with it to understand your approach and those skills that you take, then allows you the opportunity then to practice that and start to actively try and engage those skills in a different context, in a real world setting, to then make use of. So, and then lastly, of course, would be some exclusions may apply and results may vary. Now, not everybody learns the same way. Not everybody plays the same type of games or even plays games the same way. Not everybody plays the same amount as other people do, the same frequency. Not everybody has the same preferences in general or even their own learning styles. So reasonably, different people can expect different results from trying this approach just based on those variable factors in general. So other than sharing my thoughts, what is the purpose of this video, right? And I want to draw another comparison to gaming, where there is a game that is called Fable 3. And in that story, there is an inflection point where there's a great evil that is coming to destroy the kingdom. And this inflection point happens in the game where your character overthrows his brother, King Logan, and usurps the throne. And there's a revolution and they take over the throne, right? And now you lead the kingdom, basically, and are subsequently responsible for all the decisions of the kingdom. So shortly after becoming king, this is when you're informed of the coming evil that will happen in, I believe it's like 1 year's time. I don't quite remember, but then the entire rest of the game is focused on decision making, right? And depending on the decisions that you make, influence whether or not you get the good or the bad ending of the game, right? There's a lot of decisions that come up that are around compromise or upholding promises that you made during the course of starting the revolution and getting people to pledge their support to your cause. And at the end of the game, then once you've gone through a series of those decisions, influences whether or not the kingdom is destroyed and or whether or not you are blamed for it or responsible for it. So there's a parallel here, I believe, with the usurping of the throne being aligned with the release of ChatGPT in November of 2022, where we don't know how long we have, but we are now on the path where our decisions impact whether or not we're going to be getting the good ending or the bad ending of everything that AI has to offer. And I have personally no doubt that AI will improve the future, but its application to creative problem solving is what's key in order to achieve those good endings. One of the frustrations when you're playing the game after you've become king, and I think this is also echoed in many other games too, where although it's also echoed in reality, but as you're playing the game and you're presented with these different scenarios of choices that you need to make, right? Where people, they want money that you owe them, that you could be using to spend on, let's say, the army to help better fend off the coming evil there. And as a player, there was nothing more frustrating than than thinking like, God, like, don't you people understand like what's at stake here? Like, this is the ultimate evil is coming. Like our kingdom's going to be wiped out, and you're worried about me paying you what I owe you right now, whether or not it's like that particular scenario. But the frustration that not everybody is on the same page as to understanding what's at stake and being able to approach something from that same mindset. So in general, another reason why I'm making this is that if you've heard a lot of the talks online about the possible negative outcomes, both the tangible and the kind of over the top negative outcomes that could come from artificial intelligence, it's understanding that the stakes are indeed high for both positive and negative. And the quicker that people can understand both current and future paradigm shifts, I think the better. That gets us all aligned and talking from the same base of understanding. So similar to the game as well, there's going to be a series of crises, moral dilemmas, having to navigate those kinds of compromises like the one I just explained, and a lot of different trade-offs and political faction dealings in order to get to an outcome where the kingdom survives and the evil is defeated, or in this case, like the threat is mitigated, and we can live happily ever after as they do in the fables. So whether that's in the context of the game trying to acquire like what was it, like 65 million gold or something like that to fund the defense of the kingdom, or whether that's obtaining $7 trillion to fund the energy infrastructure needed to get the levels of compute at where we need them to be to have the better ending. Either way, it's a challenge that we need to overcome and to navigate in order to get to that good ending. And while in Fable 3, your choices were limited in order to impact that outcome, the great thing about being in reality is that we are not limited by only one game. In fact, the analogy gained here from just leveraging Fable alone is one of many that are applicable. And there are many other parallels and thought experiments and explorations that have already been done in the context of games and different literature that we can draw from as we approach dealing with this new challenge. Now, a lot of what I've talked about during the course of this presentation is predominantly anecdotal or my own thoughts and explorations as to these topics. I don't have particular research to quote on this. I know that there is research that exists, but overall, I believe the point of what I'm making is directionally correct and rings true, at least for myself, if not others. With that being said, what I'm hoping for a takeaway from all of this is for both gamers and non-gamers to realize that there are indeed unique skills and insights that gamers bring and are honestly a underutilized asset. There is definitely a social stigma about video games and gamers in general. And I think similar to what I was discussing before about the Pygmalion effect, I believe that this stigma also is imparted upon the gamers themselves by and large, on average, and thus most gamers don't realize or think to try and apply these skills outside of the gaming world, or realize that they do apply predominantly through the mindset of games are fun and frivolous, right? Rather than something that could be leveraged in a more meaningful way to impart skill and or are transferable to the real world. I think as we approach the future here too, I believe this stigma will also naturally decline, and a lot of the points that I'm making here today will start to become more and more apparent as the medium itself improves and evolves over time, and as it starts to integrate artificial intelligence more deeply. Video games as a medium, I believe, offer the ideal platform to engage in learning, particularly through what I've been calling contextual edutainment. But as a medium, it is one of the most flexible and will continue to be able to ingest other different types of learning within the environment of the game itself or through that medium. So that is something that I believe will start to emerge more naturally. And I'll be talking about that in the future as well. And the last piece that I would say is, in order for us to rise to the occasion of dealing with the complexities that artificial intelligence brings with it as a paradigm shift, we all need to level up and to be able to apply new and unique and novel solutions to solving a lot of these challenges. And I would speak to the gamers out there and say, challenge yourselves as the next expansion to life here, and apply your gaming mindset to the real world and see what sorts of value and challenges you can overcome here. And in general, I think that we could all benefit from bringing a gaming mindset to the real world, to adapt to the challenges that we're seeing, to collaborate together to overcome them, and to overall develop our own creative solutions and innovate what we want reality to be. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you got a lot out of this.